right. Well, Kieran, thanks so much for joining me. I'm excited to chat with you. I know me and the guys, we love Session Blood and what you and Carol do, and it's been a huge help for us. You know, we're newer to the game, obviously, than you guys. So I would love to get a little bit of background first on that. So, what got you and Carol to start your channel, to start Session Blood, and made you guys want to do that?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on today. Love you guys, and it's really good just to see more and more content creators, pushing out content. I know you guys have been doing it for a little while, so that's awesome. As far as how we got into it was and a little bit funny, really. Like we never really had like big plans to do it, but we just talk about fab stuff all the time, like with Carol and my other friends, and at one point, like, we started saying, oh, should we just like record this and put it up, see if anyone's interested? But it's one of those things where we're thinking, well, like, is this even like, are we even good enough to do this? Like, are other players going to be interested at all? But then we just thought, why not? We'll give it a go. And Carol was good at like pushing us to actually go ahead and do it rather than just talking about it. And so, yeah, one time he just came around to my place. I just took out my phone, put it on the table, and we just said, okay, three, two, one, let's go. And just started chatting about, I think the first one was about like some road to national or road to calling events way back in the day. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's basically how it started.
Yeah, that's awesome. We love your guys' stuff. We watch it. You know, whenever you put stuff new stuff out, we really enjoyed like the gameplay a ton. That's helped us. I know just seeing other people play games. Sometimes you get stuck in your little circle of friends, and you start to build like your own like mini meta inside the game. And seeing other people play decks, a lot of
Exactly.
times you
Yeah.
get a good insight in the game. So what is your background in games? Like, are you a lifelong TCG guy? Is Fab like your first deep dive into competitive plays? Like, talk about that a little bit, will you?
So when we were younger, so like a lot of my close friends now are friends that I met in high school. So when I was about sort of 14 or 15. Um, so a lot of them people like some guys that you might have heard of, like Carol and Rohan, Tom, for example, and like
Okay.
a lot of other friends I want. They don't get offended if I don't name you guys, but yeah, a lot of those guys went to the same high school when we were. So I started playing Magic with them when I was about 14, and I played like semi-competitively, I suppose you could say. So being based in New Zealand, there wasn't as big an opportunity as perhaps in like the States or in Europe for things like like Grand Prix or PTQs.
Hmm.
But I go on to PT when they had them. I used to go on to the PTQs or regionals, nationals, that sort of thing. But then we all kind of stopped playing around when we were sort of 16ish or so, and then that was kind of the end of competitive card games for a long time. Then we got into sort of years or so later, about 6 or 7 years later. It's kind of a funny story, really. One of our friends, when we were flatting, um, him and his brother had made this card game when they were younger. I forget the name of it. So the guy's name was Henry, and so his brother posted it up on Reddit, and then I think someone from Wizards saw it, Wizards of the Coast, and just sent him a bunch of like boxes of some of their newish product, some stuff that had came out. And then we kind of got back into like doing a bit of drafting and sealed, then played a bit of constructed. And then one cool thing that we used to do, and we never got back into sort of serious competitive play. But one thing we got into was doing our own like pro tour. So we'd have like
Yeah.
8 of us go away to like a holiday house or a batch as we call it here, and we'd play like 5 rounds of draft over the course of 3 days, and we'd count up the points. The winner would be the pro tour champion. We had a sort of log of wood trophy and everything. Um, so yeah, that was really cool. But we never like Flesh and Blood was kind of the when that came out, that was the game that I got back into playing competitively. Like I played a little bit on MTG Arena a little while, but that was more just sort of a bit of Hearthstone, that kind of thing. Um, I did all right on those, but as far as like real life playing seriously, talking about it all the time, yeah, Flesh and Blood was the first time in a long time that I've really gotten into a game.
Nice. So did you guys start playing immediately from the very beginning? Did you get in on any like I don't know how the game what it looked like at the start. You know, a lot of games will do like special pre-releases or big launch events. Did you guys get a chance to do any of that stuff, or did you start after the first release? When did you get involved in Flesh and Blood?
So I wasn't there from like the very beginning. So I believe there was like a world premiere event at some point where people played with the Irish starter decks, and I think there was a New Zealand player Luke Badger who won that. So shout out to you, Luke. So I wasn't around for that, and then there was the first four callings around the world when the like Welcome to Wraith just came out. So I believe there were two in America, one in Australia, one in New Zealand. Um, I'd heard of the game through my friend Tom, so he was kind of the first one out of us to really jump into it. And I was thinking about playing the calling in Auckland. I never played the game before, but I was like, well, there's awesome prizes on the line. Like, why not just get a 2 day primer and just jump in, see how it goes? There's probably a lot of people in the same boat as me. So I was pretty keen to do that, and then I double checked the dates, and the calling was on the day of my partner's birthday. And so we'd been dating for sort of 2 or 3 months at that point. And I thought, oh, that's probably a bit much to say, oh, sorry about the birthday. So yeah, I missed that one. But then after that, so I believe that was sort of October, November-ish, 2019. Can't recall the exact date. But then after that, my friend Carol and Rohan and Tom, like Tom kind of worked away at us, eventually got me to play Welcome to Race Sealed. I remember I walked in one time, I saw Tom playing Carol, and they're playing this like sealed deck game, and they've got. I look over and I see these equipments out and like a hero and a weapon, and I'm just like, what is this nonsense? I'm not going to play this game. And then Tom worked away at me, and eventually I sat down, played a couple of sealed decks, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And then I was like, I might play sealed or play casually, but I'll never get into constructed. And then like 3 days later, I went online and bought like a Mask of Momentum, a Flyndale's Tunic, and just got straight into the constructed. The first like tournament we actually went to was really cool. So I went down with Carol, and there were a number of other players that people might have heard of, people like Kale McCreath, Matt
Mhm.
Rogers, a few others and then I know Alan from LSS and
Okay.
Ian Kinderning, who does a Radio Reflex podcast, so that they organized so we went on like a 5 or 6 hour road trip down to like the city where they had a road to calling event. And Carol and I were kind of looking at each other like, what are we doing? We've been playing this game for 2 weeks and we're doing like a 12-hour round trip. But that was really good times. And I think ever since then, we've just been pretty full on to the competitive scene.
Nice. So we can like talk about the competitive scene. So you finished sixth at the calling, and had a great showing there. So what was your experience like at the calling overall? Like what did you play? What did you see? Things like that.
Yeah, well, just speaking generally first, I thought the format they did for the whole weekend was really cool. So like it was a 3 day thing with Team Sealed on Friday, Sealed Deck on Saturday, and then the actual big calling itself on Sunday. And unfortunately I couldn't play on Friday, but I played Saturday and Sunday. But I just thought that was quite cool just to because a lot of players traveling from around New Zealand to come up to the event. So I thought it was nice that LSS and Card Merchant, who helped host and run that event, put all that on. So to give people traveling, like it's not just you're traveling for the calling, and then if you
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately don't do too well, bad luck, you like spent all this money. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
As far as the calling itself went, so Carol and I ended up playing Ira on the day. We've spoken about it a little bit, but the deck we really really wanted to play was Mandible Claw Brute. So we spent like so much of our testing time working on that deck, just trying to get it across the line. We felt we had the wizard matchup in a pretty good place. Like against a really good wizard, it's still quite a difficult matchup. Like a wizard who's tested against that deck and knows what you're trying to do and knows like the break points on damage when they have to try kill you, all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's still difficult, but like it wasn't a bad matchup. But the big issue was Ira, we felt. So a deck like Brute is very good. It's got a very high ceiling. Your big turns are almost kind of right up there with Kano, with like the biggest turns of the game where you just kill someone out of nowhere. But the big issue with that deck that we found is it was a little bit variance based, like not even so much within like scab skin leathers rolling for action points, more just that you had this like strategy of like occasionally getting in a little bit of damage, but mainly building your deck around the big Blood Rush Bellow turns. And
Mm-hmm.
if you leaked too much damage over time until you drew that, often you find yourself in a spot where you're too far behind to catch up. So we spent like so much of our time doing that, and then it was like the week of the calling, and still on like Monday and Tuesday, sort of we're beginning to like give up on the deck a bit, right? We're just like we want to play this, but if we just play it on principle, we feel like we're heading for a pretty bad result. So we we switched to Ira. I kind of like a few of our teammates were playing Ira, and they'd had their deck list they'd been working on for a while. So like we'd played against them a bit. Sometimes we'd jump on Ira to help other people like either test like a mirror match, for example, or just test against a deck they were thinking about playing. Eventually, like Carol and I actually played slightly different lists. So I played a more controlly list with a bit more life gain. Carol played like slightly more mid range, a bit more aggro. Um, as far as experience for the calling went, it was a good time. Like you always get those sort of tournament jitters in a way. I feel like even though you might be like confident in yourself as a player or whatever, you go in and you're thinking like, crossing fingers like, don't get me paired up with Matt Rogers round one or Jacob Diaz or one of your good friends. And it's such a long tournament. But yeah, it was like I played a fair few Ira mirrors and against a few other decks, and I think the consistency of the deck just really shone through. So even though I hadn't like spent a big chunk of testing time on Ira, I was felt pretty happy playing the deck throughout the day.
So one of the things that I was curious about was we've played me and the guys on the channel. We've played a ton of tournaments. We love to play tournaments. Like we live for card game tournaments. It's like our favorite thing to do. Is we've driven all over like hours and hours, stayed overnight in places to play at stuff. And I was curious. Like one of the things that really struck me was that you guys played 11 rounds of Swiss, which
Yeah,
is like normally you never go into double digits no matter how big the field is, before you go to top cut. So
yeah,
what did you feel about doing 11 rounds and then doing the top cut on the same day?
yeah. It was a lot. It was a lot. So also the tournament got extended a little bit because there were just a couple of small issues with the gem software. So that's the one
Mm-hmm.
that handles pairings and tournament structure and all that. So um, like they were between a couple of rounds, there's sort of 20, 30-minute breaks just while they got it sorted, and then a bit of manual pairing. So I think it's just sort of those minor things that, this is the biggest Fab tournament to date. So just kind of minor growing pains. I'm sure it'll be all good in the future. Um, yeah, 11 rounds. It's one of those things I feel like mentally it's can be quite difficult. Particularly because like at one point you're 5 rounds through the tournament, you're like, I'm not even halfway. I I still have like I've got to play so many rounds to like do quite well. Um, I think mental fatigue towards like the very end of the Swiss and the top eight certainly became a factor. I've spoken to like a few of like the players who did really well at the calling, who said that they felt they performed a little bit worse than the top eight, like gameplay wise,
Mm-hmm.
than compared to their normal play. Um, for me, like I didn't feel too bad all in all playing. Like I feel my top like across the Swiss. I feel those little breaks actually maybe benefited me. I feel it was a little bit different. So for some people, it's fine because you get a bit of a break, you can go outside, have some water, have a coffee, something like that. But I know I spoke to like a few Wizard players in particular who I don't know if this is a universal thing, but some of them are saying, with a deck like Wizard, when you're getting on a roll, so you feel like you're in the zone, you know what you're doing, you've got to like all the lines in your mind. But then those 20 or 30-minute breaks kind of disrupt your concentration a little bit, and then you have to get back like into the mode, into gameplay mode. Um, as far as my experience, I felt generally okay. I ended up playing 3 rounds in the top eight, so I lost my first top eight game to Jacob, who really really good player. I don't think fatigue really influenced that matchup too much, to be honest. Like he beat me in the Swiss and he beat me in the top eight, and I think had we both been like completely fresh, he probably would have beaten me even more badly. So but that's fine. I think by the third, so I lost that game, then I won my losers bracket round, then I played one of my friends, Cullum, in the next top eight rounds. I think by that point, like both of us, both Cullum and myself, were starting to feel like a little bit tired. So this is about sort of 14 rounds into the tournament.
Yeah.
And saying that though, like we had a really close game. It was definitely a thriller, went right down to the wire. He managed to get me at the end, but I feel like potentially, um, particularly with like a double elimination format top eight, it might have been nice if that could have been split off and done on another, like another day. Um, I just understand like logistically that might have been difficult, especially with a lot of players traveling up for the tournament. It's maybe a bit much to ask them to potential to stay for that extra day. So
Mm-hmm.
when I mentioned before, it was really nice that they had the whole weekend thing, like Friday tournament, Saturday tournament, Sunday tournament. I suppose
Mm-hmm.
when you do structure it like that, which I think is good, it's quite inclusive. It does make it a bit more difficult to have like a 2 day format for the big event.
Yeah, I'd be curious if in the future they didn't maybe put something like the team event that's maybe more intended to be more of a casual fun. Like obviously there's prizes on the line, but if that was like the same time as Top Cut and then you just kind of plan for hopefully you have the problem that you have to maybe find another teammate to fill the spot of a buddy who made
Yeah.
Top Cut or something. That'd be a good problem to have, I suppose. But yeah, that was definitely something that I was thinking about. I know we here, we had a sealed event locally where we could actually have one in person, and I wasn't able to make it. I had something going on, but Jason on the channel with us, he actually got to go, and he said, we were talking throughout the whole day. We had like as soon as it popped on, we like had the stream on. We were all messaging back and forth all day about it. And I know here it was, I mean, we started watching the middle of the day and it was like 2 3 a.m. and there were still games going on. I'm just like I couldn't even imagine, like being there playing at that. I was tired just watching that many rounds of Flesh and Blood,
Yeah,
and it was
yeah,
it's a lot. Like when you play in tournaments, you hit those like 6 7 rounds. Some games it's best of three, so it's a little different. You're like doubling potentially your number of games played, but
yeah,
still just once you hit 6 7 8 hours of just straight gameplay, like to your point, some people it might be like the dream. Like they get in the zone, they just get going. But for other people, mentally they're just like, I just need like an hour where I can decompress a little bit, and so that's tough.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so when you were playing your rounds, do you think the meta was what you guys expected, or did you expect to see more of one thing and got another? Did you think that like it was going to be as much Ira as it was, or did you think you were going to see more Kano? Because obviously those are like the two decks that everybody kind of looks at. If you want to win a blitz event, you have to be able to beat both of those. So did you see the meta the way that you thought you were going to see it going in, or did you see something different when you actually were playing?
That's a good question. So, like you say, like Kano and Ira were the main decks we are expecting to see. The I wasn't necessarily surprised there were so many Ira players, but I was surprised that there weren't as many like Kano and potentially Viserai players. So I thought with some of the results we'd seen through some of our internal testing and all that, that Kano actually was pretty well positioned to potentially win the whole tournament. I thought decks like Dorinthia as well seemed to be in a pretty good spot, but might struggle with some of the Io or Kano matchups. Um, yeah, so I was a little bit surprised that Kano ended up making up, I think, roughly like 14 or 15% of the field. So there was just like so much Ira that, um, yeah, it was a bit surprising to me. So I mean, as far as the way like my deck was built or constructed, I don't I don't think that influenced me too much, just because like I hadn't done really enough testing to really like find out what was all the best tech and everything. So I just sort of saw a decent list and was like, yeah, I'll change a couple of things, and that seems fine. But yeah, I think Iowa certainly benefited from the metagame composition of that tournament. So I mentioned things like OTK Runeblade, which is I haven't played that a whole lot, but I have heard from like some pretty good players that once you get the gameplay and the deck list correct on OTK Runeblade, it is a very, very good matchup against Ira. Because Ira generally does like the same thing over and over again. If you're playing a defensive deck with like a built-in strategy to play around that, it can be hard for them to beat it. Um, and saying that, like, I don't know, because some of the Ira decks have evolved over time a bit as well. So something that Carol and I talked about on the podcast, that we saw these very controlly, grindy styles of Ira. So they might have things like 4 Sigil of Solace, 6 Swift Flax, 2 Sink Below, 2 Fate for Scene. So like 10 plus defense reacts, all this life
Yeah.
gain, and they just grind you out over the course of like 30 turns and like just pure incremental value. We did think that with the success of Kano in the Mighty Eight tournament, so it was tournament a couple of weeks before the calling, we felt that Ira decks would start to need to adapt a little bit to have something in their lists that could put the pressure on. Things like must block cards. So rather than just relying on things like Command and Conquer or maybe a Tyrant of Temper to get through, you have additional threats. Not even must block, but things like League Tap, just built in Go again.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Snatch, which compare with Raised Reflex or Snapdragon Scalers. Um, so as far as that went, I think we saw like the Ira decks, a number of them did trend towards that a little bit. I think some of the successful ones in the top eight, like we saw Matt and Jacob's list was a bit of a sort of a mix, I suppose, between like the very between some of the more aggro and the pure controls. They had cards like Life for a Life, Two Flying Kick, as on top of all their other threats, which helped them push through. Whereas some of the more aggro ones we saw had things like Leg Tap, Snatch, Double Razor Reflex, all that sort of thing, more leaning towards a bit more aggro. But yeah, as far as metagame composition, I was a little bit surprised. Honestly, I thought there would be more Kano, maybe a little bit more Viserai. As far as Dorinthia numbers went, I felt that was probably about the number I expected. There's a solid core of Warrior players in New Zealand that really like that class. Um, there's some, so I live in Auckland, but there's some a big scene down in Wellington. There's some very very good Warrior players down there. One of them, Jason Thompson, made the top eight.
Mm.
He beat me in the last round of Swiss, so I thought that was about right. But yeah, I think in a meta game where Ira just has so many good matchups. The sort of composition of that meta certainly helped the deck out.
Do you think that more people went with Ira because it was 11 rounds, because it's a little less mentally taxing than Kano, or do you think that it's just naturally like Kano is just a complicated deck to play, it takes a ton of reps, so like anybody who didn't feel like they were going to have Kano testing quantity just went Ira because you feel like, because I know you mentioned that in the article you wrote for Channel Fireball, how proficiency on Ira probably takes half as many reps as proficiency on Kano, just because Kano has so many little things that you have to do well. And I think decks, like every deck, it's important to like stack your pitch correctly, but like Kano, it can mean like wins and losses if you stack one card differently to make sure you hit the right combo at the right time. Because if you accidentally put two reds next to each other versus stacking correctly, like those two reds you have in your deck, you like put them right next to each other and you draw them at the wrong time, you're just like, oh great, I just died. And there's not a lot of decks that punish you that hard for misstacking your pitch.
Yeah, like you said in the article I wrote, I do think that was a factor for sure. I think of the sort of top tier competitive decks, I think Ira definitely had the biggest sort of pick up and play potential. So, um, and that's not a dig against like the Ira players or anything as well, because to play that deck at a very, very high level is actually like still pretty difficult. Like, if you're playing an Ira mirror, for example, and you're kind of getting a bit lost in like getting your value, like when to use Flick Black, all that sort of things, like a top level Ira player with like a better game plan, or perhaps they've teched out their deck a bit better, will generally beat you. That's what I found when I was playing against people like like Matt and Jacob, for example, where in both the Swiss rounds and in the top eight, like I felt just like very much out of my depth of it. Like it's one of those games you're sort of gradually losing, and then you're like, where did it all go wrong? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think the difficulty of decks like sort of OTK Runeblade and Kano make them a more difficult choice to play. So I I think like a deck like Kano in particular is that unless you've committed to that very early on and you've played a lot of games in it, it's hard to kind of just decide, oh, like what am I going to play like a week or two before I'll try Kano. Like, I mean, I actually tried that a little bit because I played a little bit of Kano over the course of Blitz. I played it very early on, then kind of like put it to one side, then came back a little bit and played it. But it was one of the decks that I was considering a last minute switch to. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll just pick up Kano and played a few games. And then I played like 3 games against Ira, just got crushed 3-0. And I was like, because my friend Rohan, who actually ended up coming ninth, he's like a very good wizard player, definitely one of the best. And I was talking to him about it, and he was saying, it's just a matter of reps. Like, you need to be able to learn the lines of play, learn when you need to go aggressive, like consider your pitch order very closely, all those sorts of things. And I think not only the fact that it's difficult to play, but that on top of that, I think there's sort of a wider variety of play styles and card choices in Kano that make it more difficult than a deck like Ira. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Ira decks, we certainly see variations between sort of ranging from the like hyper aggressive more to like the slightly more aggro to mid range to pure control. But in saying that, a lot of the game plans are fairly similar. Like, you're playing your 1+2+X deck. So your Kodachi for 1, Kodachi for 2, and then you play your big attack. Or like if you don't, you play some other attack or a sigil or all those sorts of things. Whereas for Kano, we definitely saw like a big variation in play styles and I think in lists that people play. So to give you an example of that, Jason Long and Dan McKay. So Jason Long made top 8 on Kano. I believe his testing partner Dan came 10th, I think, somewhere around there. Anyway, so they were playing a list that could play like a traditional Kano game style, or they could just play OTK Wizard. So that sort of build, and it's cool because they ran tech like a Blue Unmovable, for example,
Yeah.
which I thought was really cool because it can help take out like a Zephyr Needle in the Ira matchup. But a deck like that to play that over 11 rounds, and particularly to play it with that playstyle, takes like a lot of mental discipline and a lot of practice, I think. So just to explain that, so I think a general Wizard versus Ira matchup, like you play it in a particular way. That's, oftentimes you might take the Kodachi hit and the Zephyr Needle hits, so you're taking the 4 damage to then like block out the big attack and then sort of strip cards. You're sort of building towards dealing a bit of damage and setting up a turn where you can play at instant speed in their turn and burn them out for a bunch of damage, and then like set up a win with Riders or Talismanic Lens. They kind of flipped the script on that a little bit and played it much more in OTK game style. So the particular combo for that is you set up a Sturdy Aether Winds, a Forked Lightning, and 2 Blazing Aethers. And that one, like I said, it takes a lot of discipline because you have to block correctly over the course of the game. You need to pitch correctly at the start, and then you need to keep track of your deck as it goes along. But that's something that, as again, like I say, it takes a lot of mental discipline, a lot of skill to play over 11 rounds, and it's very, very unforgiving. Like if you make, that's the thing, in decks like Wizard, if you make one mistake, the game can just be completely over because you get put in these spots quite often where it's like, okay, do I block here, or am I going for like lethal damage on the burnout, or like can I afford this card, or am I going to need it later in the game? Do I need to consider my pitch order, all those sorts of things? Whereas on Ira, like you do get punished for a mistake, but like maybe not a lot of time, but often you can get away with it. Like, so if I make a small misblock, or if I lose a bit of tempo on one turn, a lot of time I can kind of like pick that back up over the course of the game. Whereas Wizard, like you make a mistake and the game's over.
Yeah, so Jason, who plays with us constantly, Jason, Dane, and myself, who play on the channel all the time. Jason is a devout believer in the Church of Kano, and he plays that deck a ton. And I've seen like firsthand the difference between someone who's played it a little bit, somebody who's gotten some reps on it, and somebody who has not only has a ton of reps on it, but also he's like teched it to feel like the style he likes. And it's just gotten incrementally harder to beat, and it's more and more work, especially with like not, so if I play Ira into it, I feel infinitely better about it because, to your point, like you can do a lot more incremental damage, whereas I personally I'm a warrior player, like, but that's my favorite. Dorinthia is my favorite, and that's definitely a matchup that, like, luckily I have Jason, because I think playing into probably a lot of Wizard players who are newer to it, I probably have an infinitely better matchup or I feel better about my opportunity. But against Jason, like he knows the deck, he knows how to stack it, he knows what to block, he knows when to block, and worse than anything as a warrior player, and I'm sure you'll attest to this, he knows when to not block, which makes me crazy. And he'll just be like, nope, and just kind of put his hands up and sit back. And I'm like, no, just one card, just give me one card. I can one out of hand, I need it. Yeah, how dare you shut my reprise off? And it's amazing the difference between, like, when you see that that skill level or the skill cap of a Wizard player just grow. It's impressive to watch a really good Wizard player. But to your point, like, there every now and then Jason will do something and he has something set up and he'll flip the top card and you'll just see him kind of like sink, and he realizes he just by like 2 cards he missed it, and it's like, that's game. And he'll just, he knows, like, at that moment, if he pitched it wrong or he stacked it wrong or he opted the wrong time, he'll look at those top 2 cards with like his lens and he'll just be like, no, it's over. I'm never going to get there, because he'll realize it's 2 cards deeper than he thought it was or something. And it's such a challenging deck to play. Like, I don't blame anybody for for somebody who's like a Wizard player, even for reconsidering it over 11 rounds. Like, it's tremendously taxing mentally.
Yeah, because the thing with Wizard as well is it's quite good if you play the deck a lot and you know the matchups, you can adjust your play style on the fly a little bit. So, when I say people like Jason Long and Dan when they're playing like OTK Wizard, that's not so much I think there's a bit of a misconception around that you have to build the deck to make it OTK, which isn't necessarily true. Like a lot of decks just have the tools already in the deck to play that sort of combo. It just really depends on knowing if this is a matchup where I can go down that path. And if I am going to go down that path, like how do I play the matchup? So, for example, there's some like slow decks in the meta I think that just cannot beat Wizard, or like just have an absolutely terrible matchup against Wizard because Wizard is able to adapt to that game plan during the game. So, for example, like a deck like Dash Control and Blitz, which I tried my hardest to get working for a little while as well. One of my good friends, Antonio, played it in the tournament. I think against Wizard players, it's really, really hard to beat them because you have like a certain amount of life gain. But all they need to do is chip a little bit of damage throughout the game and then set up that big combo. And like just to run through it as well, because it's not like the hardest combo in the world to pull off. So like what you need to do is you have to have like some combination. So it's like a 4 card combo basically. So you need to have Stir the Aether Winds, Fork Lightning, and 2 Blazing Aethers. And so, like, at some point in the game, you can set one of those cards in Arsenal. But basically, you need to pitch 3 of those to, so you need to pitch 4 blues to the bottom. And then you need to make sure that underneath those 4 blues, you have 3 of those cards. So maybe it's like, Blazing Aether, Stir, and Forked. And once you have that, it's actually not crazy hard to keep count of because you say, okay, I've got these 7 cards on the bottom. And then from there, you just kind of keep track of how many cards you've pitched underneath it. So, you've got the 7, and then, next turn you pitch 4 cards. You're like, okay, now it's 7 plus 4. And then you just kind of, you can count your deck face down at any point in the
Mm-hmm.
game and keep track of that. And then once you have that set up, once you draw your 4 blues and you have your energy potions out, you basically just like crack all your resources, like all your potions, your tunic, you pitch your cards, and you just banish 3 of those cards and play out the whole combo. So you just go Stir, Forked with Crucible of Aetherweeds, Metacarpus Node for like 14 damage, and then you play 2 Blazing Aethers using the Storm Striders somewhere along there. Um, so that, like, the thing about, yeah, so Wizard is a really cool deck because you can just like shut down hyper control decks that just want to like do small bits of damage throughout the course of the game. But again, against decks like Ira, there's a lot of relevant on-hit triggers. There's cards like Command and Conquer, which become must blocks. You play cards that block for 0 in your deck, things like Energy Potion. So
Mm-hmm.
there is like a very real skill in mastering that playstyle and basically knowing how you have to play other matchups too.
So after the calling, I know, Facebook is a buzz always, like the groups always get really like there's tons of
Yep.
conversation going on around the results of things, and every game ever in the history I think of TCGs has a community moment where after one deck it's has like a really big performance, or maybe it performs really well too many times, or has too many of a top 8. Immediately everybody's conversation shifts to, okay, how do they touch that deck to fix it? And I know, like we had mentioned, you wrote an article for Channel Fireball, which, by the way, we'll put a link to that, and we'll put a link to Session Blood for anybody who hasn't followed or doesn't follow you guys. We'll make sure they get a link in the description for this. But you wrote an article about it saying that you don't necessarily agree with the fact that Ira might need touched. Can you talk about why, like what your perspective is? And obviously they can read the article for more depth, but kind of like a high level, why do you think Ira is just okay now and it'll be fine going forward?
Yeah, so that's something I feel like pretty strongly about, I feel. So yeah, I wrote this article called like In Defense of Ira. So I was thinking like what to write, and I think there's already been like a number of very good tournament reports put up there. Like Carol published one, people read them on the fan page, and I felt that like I didn't necessarily have a whole lot to add in that regard. So I wanted to write about Ira because, like you mentioned, there's been a lot of talk about it. I It's one of those articles that I kind of like put myself out there a little bit, right? Because I feel we could look back and say 3 or 4 weeks time and I just have to like completely eat my words because like the Ira decks, it's just so consistent, it's versatile, it can adapt to play different ways that it actually just is too strong and it doesn't need changes. But what I feel about the deck is that I think there were just like factors that made it do really well, but the deck isn't inherently broken. So, like I mentioned earlier, I felt decks that can do very, very well against Ira, things like Kano and OTK Viserai, weren't played in large numbers. I think Kano is a deck that is difficult to learn, and even on top of that, like for experienced Kano players, like I talked to like some really good Wizard players, and some say that even when you've played 200 or 300 games in the deck, like you still find yourself like learning things or testing out different variations and all that. Um, Another thing is the thing about restrictions and banless. I just feel that from like a principle perspective, that as a player base, like I feel a lot of people know about like the whole Magic the Gathering thing, where it's just like infinite bans all the time. Like cards come out, yeah, they're printed badly, and they're too good, they need to get banned. I what I feel personally is that we should really be careful about setting that precedent of a deck does pretty well, therefore it needs restrictions or bans immediately. The Like if we look at the factors involved here, like this was one Blitz tournament, like I know it's probably the biggest. I believe it is the biggest like in-person Fab tournaments so far, 157 players. But we have to put that into perspective. When we look at things like organized play in a lot of the world, I know in America and Europe, like Taiwan, Malaysia, and all the other regions, Australia, for example, it's been like heavily curtailed because of COVID. So, like, there's been restrictions put in place that are necessary for health and safety. So, a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to really like dig down and play this game a lot. So, I know there's been like online tournaments and stuff, but when you have if you're looking at banning or restricting out cards from a deck based on one tournament from one meta game, like I think it would have to be like overwhelmingly dominant for that to happen, and you'd have to like look at the meta and say like there just isn't a way to fix this. Um, I think for Ira, if we'd been in like a non-COVID world and we'd have like 4 or 5 thousand or however many, I don't know the exact number, but many thousands of players, all sort of playing against each other, working on deck lists, working on strategies. I feel that Ira may not necessarily have done as well. I mean, it still would have done really well, but I think we might have seen like a greater diversity in the top eight. Um, I think with such a young game and before, like with a young game, a young format, even Blitz hasn't been around for all that long, relatively speaking. Um, I just don't think restrictions and bans right now are the right way to go. I think it might be sort of unfair to some of the international players that we're just sort of saying, rather than giving you a chance to like, learn from our experiences and adapt to the meta game, we're just gonna outright nerf or ban this deck, for example. I On top of that, I feel like a lot of the cards that are in the spotlight that people look at might not necessarily have the impact that people think they will. Um, the number one card that comes to mind is Flick Flack. So if you look at some of the top eight profiles, for example, from the calling, so where they got people like fill out things like what's the most important card in the meta, all that sort of thing. Like I think like 6 players, including myself, wrote down Flick Flack, like 5 or 6. But when I actually think about it, even if you like restricted or banned Flick Flack, I don't think that would change the nature of the deck that much. Like it might make some of the matchups like slightly harder, but I still think against like most of the aggro decks that Ira would likely have a positive matchup. Like if you took out 6 Flick
Mhm.
Flacks and put in 6 below, um, I think just the fact that their defense reactions and Ira plays around incremental value and plays very defensively means that there aren't a ton of situations, or it's not relevant enough that suddenly a deck like you know warrior or ranger or aggro mech is just gonna like waltz in and start crushing Ira. So uh, I think it would actually be a look really bad if you ban or restrict certain cards that doesn't change the meta at all. Um,
Mhm.
Other ones that people have mentioned, things like drone of brutality, for example. I saw that pop up on Facebook recently as one of the targets. I I can see why like that card is frustrating because it gives Ira this inevitability where you can just grind out during the course of the game. You don't really have to care about your deck size too much because when it gets towards the end of the game, if you've got the tempo, then you just infinite cycle them of like Kadachi drone, and just like or even at the start of the
Yeah.
game, you throw 2 threats in the hand for free and it goes back on the bottom of your deck. But again, I don't know if that would necessarily fix things. So I feel like my philosophy is kind of that we need to let this play out a little bit more before just like jumping in and saying, like, based on the results of this one tournament from this one meta game, we want to restrict all ban cards. Um, and on top of that, I don't think some of like the cards that the community might have targeted might necessarily like fix the metagame as such. Um, so yeah, I mean that's largely like yeah. So I'm trying to like organize my thoughts because I know I wrote
Yeah.
quite a lot about this and I had a few points like a few other points, but that's mainly my big thing is that I think the New Zealand meta sometimes can also, and maybe it's happened with other card games, can be a little bit insular, in that we tend to follow some of the best decks and a lot of people play them. But I do feel like there are decks out there that can beat Ira, and now that Ira is kind of shown up as the top dog in the meta, I feel like it should have the you know it should be in the sights of people. So if you're building your deck, you might take it more towards Ira than you would towards Kano. So I think a lot of players thought there'd be more Kano, thought they had to split their focus. But perhaps if we target Ira more, play decks that can beat Ira, or change our decks in order to have a better matchup against Ira, then it shouldn't be as dominant as it was made out to be.
Yeah, I think the danger in, bans and restrictions is always the things that get touched or get affected that are accidental. That's the thing that sometimes, and you never know. Like that's always the interesting thing is I think there are a lot of people who play Flesh and Blood who it's like this is like the revitalization of their TCG career. Maybe they haven't played for a number of years. They saw Flesh and Blood and they're stepping back into a game, and maybe they've been away from TCGs for a while. So maybe they just don't like, they're not necessarily in the mindset. I'm somebody who plays actively and competitively in Flesh and Blood as much as I can be, but I also play Dragon Ball Super competitively and have played in as many events as humanly possible in that. And I think the thing that people forget about is like sometimes when you ban or restrict a card for one deck, it has unintended consequences on another deck that might not even be at the level of that deck, right? Because if you take Flick Flack away, you might touch Ira, but then what about like people who are just like, well, I'm just playing Katsu or Benji over here trying to enjoy my life, and you've made my life miserable. Like because of these guys, now I can't play my favorite deck. And you start to alienate players, like you have to be careful. Or even, somebody mentioned like Snapdragon Scalers, and I'm like, that would absolutely like ruin like, but the second deck I love to play is Ranger, and it's like if you took Snapdragon Scalers from that deck, sometimes the only thing that keeps me alive in that deck is being able to have a turn where you just absolutely pour on a ton of damage because you can Snapdragon into a second attack. And the unintended consequences of like banning and restricting cards sometimes is the thing that people forget about. Is you get hyper focused on like Ira, and then what really needs to happen is, I think, what I would be interested to get your perspective on next is I'm curious if people will naturally go to Kano and Runeblade to combat Ira, but then as a result of that, people seeing maybe more people play it, well, they'll just naturally shift off of Ira. So we'll have like a kind of a natural ebb and flow of the meta, like where people will move away from Ira for fear that it's going to get targeted. So they don't want to play a deck that's like public enemy number one, I guess. Like that's the thing that makes me curious a lot of times in these situations is like, if you're playing the deck that's public enemy number one and people start teching against you, even if you're playing the best deck, it still feels, it's hard to play with the target on your back.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That's quite interesting to me, and I think when you mention things like having ripple effects, for example, if you ban out cards like uh, things like Flick Flack, for example, how they might affect decks like Kano, sorry, or like Katsu or Benji even. Um, and I think on top of that, it's really difficult sometimes when even beyond that, when you have unintended consequences for banning, if you restrict or ban cards and then it makes that deck weaker, and then another deck just pops up as absolutely dominant because you've weakened this matchup here or there. Um, so that's definitely one thing. As far as people switching decks go, I think one issue is that like a lot of players at this point are like pretty dedicated to playing Ira. And again, one thing for Ira, one thing I mentioned in my article is like Ira's provided quite a good pathway for a lot of new players to get into the game. So players who've never sort of played Classic Constructed because they've got into the scene, around about the time of the announcement of the Blitz calling. Um, I I think we'll still see a lot of IRAs pop up just because, like I mentioned, it's quite hard to switch from a deck like that into something like Kano or Viserai. Um, if you if like Ira's been your main experience and you haven't had a lot of experience playing other decks outside of that, um, so again, not a knock on newer players. It's just that would just be my perception. Like I would hope that we'd see, a few more players giving things like Viserai and Kano a chance, and that those would sort of grow. The player base for those would grow naturally to counter some of these decks. But
Hmm.
I think we'll still see a solid core of Ira for quite a while. Um, that was actually one of my concerns picking up Ira and going into the calling. Is talking with a few of my friends about it, the issue we saw there is that like I'm picking up a deck and I'm playing a deck that I've played a decent amount, but I'm going into a tournament where I'm playing against players who have played it a lot, so they're going to have like a better grasp at that mirror match or set of matchups.
Hmm.
Um, Ultimately, that was a risk I just kind of had to take and go with it. I do think that we might see some of the players that have been around the game for a very long time. So they've had a chance to play in say Classic Constructed with decks like Runeblade and decks like Wizard or Kano. So they've had a chance to experience that before. They might have just messed around playing those a bit before the calling. Who might think that now Ira's is like the deck that everyone's going to play. We might try something different, or like we'll try cater a strategy specifically in these decks to really target Ira and beat it. Um, so I feel like for the skirmish events that have been announced, um, I'm really I've got my fingers crossed, and I'm hoping that for the Blitz ones, at least a few of them will have non-Ira winners. So I mentioned in my article that I'm committing to like not playing Ira, so we'll see how I go. I think I might have a look at something like Kano or Viserai myself, see how that can go. One thing I did want to mention is because a card you brought up that I think is a very interesting one is Snapdragon Scalers.
Hmm.
Now, you mentioned particularly ripple effects, how that can have out. Like if you ban out Snapdragon Scalers, it really hits decks like Katsu, decks like Azalea, um, even other decks. Like for example, in Brute, I play Snapdragon Scalers in the Wizard matchup to um, to get off my Savage Feast because in that matchup, if you can Snapdragon Scales a Savage Feast, that almost gives you like a third Blood Rush Bella turn, like a mini version of that. Um, so I do think there is an issue with that card that it can impact other decks. Although in saying that, I really feel that Snapdragon Scalers is the biggest problematic card in Ira, more so than Drone of Brutality, Flip Flak, other cards that people bring up. I actually feel that's like public enemy number one in a way for Ira. Um, the reason for that is because it lets what is naturally sort of a more controlly or even slightly mid range deck. It allows that deck to play as like a stealth combo deck sometimes, or in a way because you've got this card, so it's face up, so everyone can see it, but it's constantly threatening just this like massive blowout turn. So there's so many. That card is just so versatile. Um, it costs nothing to use. You just have it. Starts the game of play. You can crack it for free in the attack reaction step, and it just makes blocking. First of all, makes blocking a lot more difficult against an Ira player, and secondly, it just like completely changes the math on what the deck can do. So I think the big ones are things like, Lightning Strike, for example. You can set up a turn where you go like Kadachi and Lightning Strike with like, you can either Lightning Strike for 8 as your second hit, you can Lightning Strike for 6 with the +1 from Ira and draw a card. Um, at this point, you're threatening things like Razor Reflex if they don't fully block it out. You're threatening a big blowout if they do block it. You can crack the Snapdragon, follow it with Command and Conquer. That's just one example. Things like Torrent of Tempo, another big one. You can go Kadachi, Torrent of Tempo. If they don't block it, then you have Go Again built in. You save the Snapdragon. If they do block it, then you've got another big follow-up attack. There's just so many positions, and it also turns on things like the Crane Dance into either Fine Center or Heron Slide.
Hmm.
So the whole weakness of that combo that you need to get the Soul Beast strike off and all this other things into it, all that's just completely mitigated because you have this pocket play where you just go Crane Dance, Snapdragon, Kieran slot you for 6, like game over, like against like Kano and decks like that, or even Fine Center to just completely get you back in the game. Um, so I really feel that if you force a deck like Ira to play something like Breeze Rider Boots, for example, yes, you have the additional armor, but I think it takes out such like it just takes out that one critical turn from Ira where you can just like really put your foot on the gas, grab the tempo. Even if you don't get that much damage through, you've now got the tempo, and you've got a deck that's very good at controlling the tempo, and you can kind of play for that one turn, and from that turn, control the game for the rest of the game. So, yeah, if anything, so I've gone on a little bit about Snapdragon, but like the more I think about it, I feel like that might be the problem card. Again, because of the factors that you mentioned, and because of like the other factors I've talked about, um, I still feel that cards shouldn't be like restricted or banned right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and honestly, I feel like LSS has had a pretty good track record so far. Like they kind of know what they're doing. Um, I feel like they'll probably look at the situation pretty closely, and they'll make a call on it, and it is what it is. But yeah, from a philosophical standpoint, I guess like just looking at the game, taking a step back, I feel that like even something like Snapdragon that's so good, like the issues with like if you were to look at restrict, like you can't, I suppose banning because you can't restrict it, is that it does have that ripple effect that you talked about, and even then there might
Yeah.
be decks that can up and counter it even with that card available.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it is amazing to I think to your point, I think the power in that card is literally the fact that it's not conditional because like as a warrior player, that's the one thing about bolters is that you stare at my refraction bolters face up the whole game. The difference is when you can stop me from you have the option basically to stop me as my opponent, whereas like Snapdragon feels bad because on something like Soul Bead, you drop a red Soul Bead, and I'm looking at the bolt or not the bolters, I'm looking at the Snapdragons, and I'm looking at the Soul Bead, and I think to myself, whether this hits or not, I could still
Yeah,
just get smacked. Like I could absolutely be punished. Like I can, if I don't block it, I'm getting hit by it, and they get go again. And God forbid they have like a razor, and I don't have a reaction. I just eat like 8 damage, or I block it, and then they just pop Snapdragons, and now I get to take the next thing, and I only have 2 cards left in hand, and I already ate 2 Kodachis. And you're in like a weird spot where like if it weren't, and it's really really weird how it really is just Ninja because there's so much inherent go again in their cards that it's like play this card for 0, it has go again. Oh, play this card for 0, it has conditional go again. Also, I have this option to just give it go again if you block it out. And it's like that's definitely the pain in that card. But I think to your point, like up to this point, LSS has given me no reason not to trust them. And who knows what's coming. And again, like meta games tend to work themselves out over time because that's just what happens. Like good card players naturally lean into the thing that's oppressive, and then the best players in the game are the ones who make the meta calls, who go, okay, everybody's going to go after Ira, so what's the thing that still beats Ira but now beats everybody else because they're leaning into Ira. And it makes for like a really interesting like meta calling challenge where people are forced to try and figure out like, what do I think everyone else is going to play, so what's the thing I can play. And sometimes you're just punished because you think you're brilliant, and you show up with like the deck that you're like, we've tested this deck, it beats everything and we're going to win. And then everybody just shows up with Ira and you're like, yeah, we meta called that wrong, like we're about to get pummeled, it's going to be a real painful Swiss.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like, I could, like I can mention, I could be totally wrong. Like there could be restriction Bandless comes out, and like some of the cards I've mentioned on it, maybe they are on it, and they've looked at it and they said like these are problematic. So it is what it is. Um, but yeah, I feel like we should have like a little bit of faith in the meta game. Like see what happens first. And like I said, if in a month's time it's just Ira absolutely everywhere, like it's sweeping all the online skirmish events in like Europe and the States and
Mm-hmm.
everywhere else they're being hosted, then that's something we probably have to revisit. And I'll have to jump on and say, I guess I was wrong. I miscalculated the strength of that deck. But I think that even if that is ultimately what happens, I still think it's the correct call as of Well, yeah, I still feel like we should give people like the opportunity first to have a chance at seeing if like
Mm,
there are solutions to their deck. Um, I mean, maybe in like a different context or a different scope, it might be a bit different. Like, for example, there's supposed to be world championships at some point. There's been like we just know that because there's been nationals, and Alice has mentioned there'll be a worlds at some point. If there was a situation where like worlds was 1 month away, and there was this deck that was just like completely busted, and like it was clearly inherently very good, and it would just completely warp the format, then maybe that would be a spot where like an emergency restriction or banning would be necessary to give players enough time, or so this showcase event isn't ruined. Um, and I mean, there is an issue as well, I suppose, when I talk about there being potential counters in the meta game, that if a deck is just like so good, the meta game becomes IRA and anti-IRA. Like I
yeah.
guess that is a bit of an issue as well. Whereas so maybe it's not necessarily winning every tournament, but the only way to compete with it is playing like a specifically anti-IRA deck. Um,
Mm.
I can see that being a bit of an issue, and I'm not totally sure if where the solution would lie with that. But I'm hoping that at the moment there is a middle ground, particularly for a deck like Kano, which I think is like very strong in Blitz, and I think with kind of more practice against and more practice, maybe switching up a few cards here and there. We saw things like the Blue Unmovable come through. Maybe we see people experimenting with things like a Red Fate for scene, for example, or like switching up their list a little bit to to I haven't played a ton of Wizards, so I'm kind of guessing here, but just kind of like changing the list, tweaking them a little bit,
Yeah.
like really zeroing in on that one particular matchup, playing against some of the deck lists that came out from the top eight of the calling, and just really figuring out those exact lines of play and thinking like I'm going into a very heavy Iron meta. Maybe I'll change my deck so it's like slightly weaker against like the mirror or slightly weaker against some other decks, but just to really zero in and make sure I can beat this deck.
Yeah, I think the other thing that will be interesting, and as we kind of wrap up because we're closing in here on quite a long talk, but I know the last big thing I was really interested in is Ira is really strong, Kano is really strong, and maybe people are just tired of seeing them. But some of that can be resolved pretty quickly by just saying, okay, the next big event is Classic Constructed, because number one, nope, you're not gonna. No one's gonna show up with 20 health Ira if they're playing 40 health, literally anything. But also like Kano has kind of been shown to be good at times in Classic Constructed, but it's a lot harder to burst somebody from 40 than it is from 20 in incremental twos and threes here and there leaking through doesn't have the impact for Kano as when I start at 20 and I leak 2 or 3 2 turns, now I'm all of a sudden within lethal and I can be one shotted, whereas that takes a lot more turns, and Kano probably leaks more damage in Classic Constructed, which is why Kano is still something that seems to be getting figured out how to make it as strong in Classic Constructed. So going forward, what do you see? Like, are you excited to go back to playing Classic Constructed? Do you like the Blitz format? Would you like to see a world where it's just 50-50 all the time? Like, what do you think is the way that the game is Blitz? I think Blitz is friendly, obviously, for growing the game. But what do you see as like the ideal kind of situation for the game as far as its like, styles of play, constructed versus Blitz?
Um, I feel like I do really enjoy Classic Constructed. Like I haven't played Classic Constructed in like a long time now because with Blitz being the calling and everything, and in New Zealand we've already had nationals in the current meta game with Classic Constructed. That really did get put to one side. Um, but I do personally I feel like there should always be a spot reserved in the game for like big tournaments for Classic Constructed. I feel that's kind of the like kind of like purest form of the game in a way. Like I think Blitz is really good. It's great for things. For example, like growing the game. I feel like we've had a ton of new players come through in the New Zealand scene because of Blitz, and just being able to play that shorter life format. And I think that Blitz is like really good spot for things like skirmish events, armories, even like big tournaments here and there. Um, Ultimately, I I feel like Classic Constructed should still be Like, I mean, and again, I've got no idea what what LSS plans are in this regard, but I feel like Classic Constructed should still like have a central spot for like very high level tournament play. Um, so like things like World Championships, for example, whenever that comes around, and like national championships, which we've had previously, I feel like having those at least with like a significant number of Classic Constructed rounds would be nice to see going forward. I think with you just have a bit more scope for for like gameplay, for running through certain plans, for like
Mm-hmm.
tempo, momentum, things like that in Classic Constructed than you do in Blitz. I think Blitz is built to be like a very different style of gameplay, but I think it's hard sometimes in Blitz that if certain strategies, if they're like built around, I'm gonna like take a bit of damage here and there, and drop down a little bit, and then like really respect the tempo and go for this like longer term strategy that might require like a 15 to 20 turn timeline rather than like a 5 to 10 turn timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's difficult to do in Blitz because you do it in Blitz and you're like, okay, I've taken a little bit of damage, and then you like start to try take control back of the game, and suddenly it's over. That's it.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit more inherent variance in Blitz than there is in something like Classic Constructed, which again is fine. But yeah, I'm looking forward to playing a lot of playing a bit more Constructed going forward. Like just going back to some of the old decks, messing around with them a bit. And I guess another big factor is Monarch. Monarch's coming out at the end of April.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's another factor that maybe can count towards things like restrictions / bans. Is that in a few months' time the meta is going to be completely different anyway. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if a deck's a problem, then it's been identified and it's very clear it's a problem, then maybe something will need to happen. But yeah, I feel like with the upcoming release of Monarch, I'm like really keen to get into some like good old fashioned Classic Constructed, like play these 60 cards, these 60 plus card, like 40 life decks, and uh, really just having a bit more scope to like build around like all these game plans, that kind of thing. Um, yeah, so I do think Blitz is here to stay. I think that's a good thing, and I think Blitz will always there'll be a lot of Blitz going forward into the future for a lot of different types of events. But I I really do think that Classic Constructed is a super fun format as well, and I'm really hoping that there's definitely in organized play terms, there's like a slice of the pie carved out going forward for Classic Constructed.
Yeah, we've kind of I've been quoted as saying on multiple occasions that I hope Blitz is where like, it's like the place where you make a name for yourself, but then like Classic Constructed is where the big boys play, because I think there's something to your point about the fact that like it Classic Constructed takes away some of the variance, because you can't like blowout turns aren't as blowout. You have to have more than one blowout turn to win a game in Classic Constructed. And then, I'm a firm believer in any game that involves a sideboard. Any moment that you say like you bring X amount of cards to the game, but you don't get to play with all of them, like in the game per se, like with the sideboarding and being able to pre-sideboard with your matchup. I think that adds a layer of complexity that requires a knowledge base that like rewards the best players in the game. And I think personally, like I like Blitz. I enjoy it. We do a live stream on Tuesdays, and we play a lot of Blitz there. We've played UPF and done all that just because we like the different formats and it's fun to play. But there's something about like the feel of Classic Constructed where it feels even more so like a one-on-one fight. Like you really have to know your game plan. You have to know what your opponent's trying to do, and you do have to like manage it in a different way, because I think there are times where certain strategies work in Blitz where you're just like, yeah, sometimes you just let something through because the next game you can just win. And that happens in Classic Constructed, but typically it happens after you've had a lot of setup. It requires a lot of pitching correctly and setting up a big turn later, because if you miss your big turn in Classic Constructed, then you can be so far behind you get tempoed out of the game. Whereas in Blitz, sometimes it's like, I think this is the turn where I just hope I don't lose to like a Razor, and then I just win next turn. And, that it Classic Constructed can take some of the variance out, which is cool, because it does reward, it feels like, really gifted players who understand the meta and stuff. And it's not to say that Blitz is like a completely variance based thing. I think this is the least, RNG game I've ever played in my life, because it really does reward good play and an understanding of when to block and when not to block. But obviously Blitz is, with less life and smaller decks and stuff, sometimes RNG can get the best of you. And I so the last thing, this is the last question. I promise I won't keep any longer, but this is the last question. With Monarch coming out, because you mentioned it, and I want to make sure I take an opportunity to ask, what do you want to see in Monarch, or what is like the thing that you would be really interested in seeing? Because this is kind of like a thing that we've had going on our channel for a while. Anybody who comes on has to be asked this question, like, what's kind of like your wish list thing? Like, what's the dream thing you would love to see? And then the other thing is, what do you have any guesses on what you actually think we'll see versus like what your wish is?
Um, I guess what I want to see is uh, like some new classes, maybe, because like I think in my top 8 profile, for example, they asked like, what are you most looking forward to in Monarch, like class wise? Like I'd love to see. I think I said there, and I'll stand by it, something like a Bard slash Alchemist class. Along those lines, I think some of those might have been in like the lore book, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That came out. So I think being able to play around with yeah, just having some like completely fresh, something completely different will be really fun for a game. Because even a game that like I love playing Fab, like a day or two after the calling, I'm up there on FabDB, like making a new deck list and just playing around with stuff. But I do think with like if there are new classes and stuff like that, that'll just completely fresh again. And there's always like new
Mm-hmm.
generic cards stuff that you can throw into your old decks, and like the bigger the card pool, the more strategies there are. So um, I guess yeah, that would probably be it. The big thing is uh, the new classes. That's what I'm looking forward to the most. If there's no Bard, no Alchemist, like whatever, I'll have a look at new ones, and I'll probably pick one as my favorite, and do my best to make a good deck out of it. As far as what I think will be in it, honestly, it's a tough one. Alice is good at surprising people. Like like
Yeah.
for example, I when I heard of the Arcane Rising, for example, when it got announced, and there were like one or two mini spoilers. I think it's the Auckland Constructor calling. But then when we started getting spoilers of things like arcane damage, I was like, whoa, what? Like, I mean, other people probably saw that coming, but I was just like, whoa, that's something completely different. Like, we're running like maybe there'll be some sort of like ranged class or something akin to flying in Magic, but like arcane, I was like, that's really cool. Like seeing things like null
Yeah.
runes, I was like, whoa, what? Um, I'm not really too sure what's going to be in Monarch. I know I've read a couple of things because that there's been things like the light and dark theme.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've seen pictures of booster boxes. Some having like light themed packs and some having dark themed packs.
Yeah.
Um, and a couple of things I've read online about people speculating if there might be like light and dark cards, for example. That only go with particular things, or um, what was the other one, or having like some heroes and some villains, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think that could that could be really cool. Like that, would introduce a new aspect. And I think one of the promotional things I saw online as well, for there was an online store selling it, and they had a quote that like Monarch, when the pitch system will become fully realized. And I mean,
Yeah.
according, again, I can't verify this at all, but according to the store that posted it, that was from someone at LSS. Um, and I've been trying to think, like, amongst my friends, we've been talking about like what can that mean? Like what does the pitch system being fully realized means? And I mean, I don't know. I'm not the most creative person, I feel sometimes, so I have no idea. But like whatever it is, I'm really looking forward to it. So like maybe it's something to do with that light and dark theme, or maybe that's just like an aesthetic thing for marketing product or whatever. But whatever it is, and I also noticed there were like 6 legendaries in the set.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually think when they said like 4 new heroes, you think, okay, well that's 1, 2, 3, 4 plus a generic legendary is 5. Like what's the 6 legendary? So is it something like along those light and dark themes, or is that just like a bigger red herring, and they're just kind of trying to send us in one direction? It's actually something completely different. Um, I honestly don't know, but whatever it is, I'm hyped. I'm really looking forward to it. Like I can't wait to play some sealed, some draft, make some new decks. So I feel like whatever I predict, it's probably going to be totally wrong, because LSS is really, really good at surprising people. But basically,
Yeah.
I have faith in them, and whatever it is, it's going to be super exciting.
Yeah, I know I remember when spoilers came out for Crucible, and they did the Doot thing where they put like the spoiler. The thing that made it great for us was the fact that Mark, who plays with us and has been on the channel a bunch of times, Mark is like a devout brute player, and he was so disheartened by the idea of having to play Doot the Brute. And we still like he actually found out. So he and his wife are having a little boy, and we were like, Doot's a pretty cute nickname. Like you could call him Doot. He's like a little brute. So they do such a good job of like advertising it well and getting everybody excited about things. So I'm with you. I'm whatever they give me, I'm excited for. I'm just ready to
Yeah.
play. I know this is like the first game I've ever played where sealed is actually something I enjoy playing. Like historically, I don't enjoy playing suboptimal decks, but in this game, it's totally different. Like sealed, the game doesn't feel like super variance based as far as getting lucky and opening like that one card that just breaks the game. So I'm excited for Monarch. So Kieran, thanks so much for coming on and hanging out and talking and stuff. I want to make sure I give you a chance real quick. Give us a quick, if you want to give any shout outs, tell anybody thanks to your boys who test with you. Make sure you tell them where to find Session Blood and stuff. So give your shout outs. Go for it.
I always very appreciate because I always like feel like I forget people or miss people, but I'll do my best. I suppose I first of all shout out to you and you guys, Outcast Haven. Thanks for having me on today and keep doing what you're doing. Love your work. Aside from that, yeah, Session Blood, you can find us on YouTube and Spotify. Just type in Session Blood, it should show up. And as far as shout outs, like there's so many people, but I'm just going to keep it kind of limited because for time and all that. The big ones, I want to give a big shout out to my co-host, Carol, who was like a huge part of the whole Session Blood, like pushing it forward and everything. Amazing testing partner. And to my testing group, the Scar Boys, as we call ourselves. You guys are all awesome. Thank you so much for. So if I run through the names, so we got Callum, Jordan, Carol, Rohan, Antonio, and Chris, and Tom. Jeez, nearly forgot Tom. Would have got in trouble there. Big shout out to all you guys. Thanks for being an amazing testing team. Like I wouldn't do well at all without you. And finally, a shout out to my partner Ricky for, being very gracious about like letting me have time testing for the calling on all that. Come home, play 3 hours of Fab, and then go to sleep to make it and all that. So she's been super supportive. Really, she plays a bit of the game herself. So thank you, appreciate all that.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for hanging out with us for this. If you haven't already, like and subscribe, and then make sure in the description you go down there. We'll have a link to Session Blood, and we will have a link to Kieran's article on Channel Fireball. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.